Thank you, and especially Lisa, thank you for that last little plug. That was wonderful, much appreciated. We will go to questions in a moment here, but I wanted to encourage a bit of exchange amongst our panelists. Before doing that, though, I have a couple of questions, or one question for each of you. So Nik, I had a research institute at the University of Ottawa that gives me a really wonderful catbird seat to look at a whole host of different sectors. So yes, energy is, an area that I do a lot of work in, as a lot of folks in this room would well know, but I also get an opportunity to look at some of these issues that they're playing out in artificial intelligence, gene editing. I mean, take your pick, name your sector. You mentioned it at the outset. Energy might think of itself as special, but this is playing out in other sectors. Is there any, we've had a lot of negative thoughts here, and I think that's entirely appropriate, right? We're in a phase where we're trying to frame up, where do we go with this research agenda? What can we do to try to address polarization? So we're kind of in the problem definition phase. But are there any things that you see happening in other sectors, Nik, that give you some hope, ways that they're trying to grapple with these issues that perhaps we should be thinking about when it comes to energy, environment, and energy transition?
Yeah, in a lot of the research that we do, actually, if I was to, not to put myself out of work, but if I was to summarize 30 years of polling that people would have on a lot of public policy issues, it would actually just be summarized to people saying, don't mess things up. That's what they would say. Let me, go to work, let me look after my parents, let my kids grow up, let's have a nice life. I don't have to be rich, I don't want to be poor, but don't mess things up, government. I think for the sectors that have done a better job at their narrative, they've actually done two things. First of all, what they've done is they've advanced two narratives. One narrative related to choice and one narrative related to stability. And I think this links into both what Dale and Lisa have talked about. That ultimately people want some level of stability in their lives. So if we were trying to position energy choices for the future, they should be framed in terms of a stable future, as opposed to an uncertain future. Because when you look at the polling, it's the uncertainty that worries people and makes them frustrated. So if you talk about an energy project and frame it from the perspective of this energy project will help create a certain level of stability in our economy, in the our energy bills, in the future, that people will more likely be willing to accept that. And then the other thing is to get away from what I'll call the referendum syndrome. It's not about whether you like or dislike a particular energy project, or any project for that matter. It's about the choices that that project represents. So if you say, for example, let's just pick something, oh, you don't like power lines in your neighborhood. Okay, that's fair. You don't like power lines in your neighborhood. So what are we going to do? How are you going to get power to your house? And to change that, and I think, to Lisa's point, when she talked about kind of collective action, I think, when we've done polling, it's clear that people are willing to make sacrifices if they think it's for a purpose and if they think it's for a social good. But right now, much of the narrative is focused much more on oneself and on today. So I would say if there are learnings from other sectors that have kind of done a better job, it would be to focus on a narrative of stability and how good energy policy leads to stability in the economy, and then to also focus on choices, not to ask whether people like one form of energy over another and have that kind of popularity contest, but to talk about, what is the right choice, and that there are choices, and it's not just about you accepting or rejecting a particular project in your community.
Great, thanks, Nik. There's some things you said in there I want to come back to. For now, though, I'm going to move down with a couple of other questions, and then we can come back to those. So, Dale, one of the things that I've found extraordinarily interesting about the Ecofiscal Commission, and you alluded to it in your remarks, but I'd like to maybe ask you to elaborate a little bit on it, is so the Commission is not only about the evidence. The Commission of Economists that are developing these, evidence-based policies, but is also about, as you mentioned, an advisory group that brings together politicians from a variety of different partisan stripes, from a variety of different levels of government. Can you talk a little bit more about what the role that, at least at the origins, how the Commission, the Ecofiscal Commission, what the thinking was behind that, and maybe then kind of a few years on, here we are now in an environment where it's increasingly polarized. Do you see the use of that advisory council differing in the future? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, some good questions. So I think that initially we wanted that advisory board for two main reasons. And one was to give us advice, to, exactly as the name implies, to draw on their own perspectives and their own kind of unique political insights and instincts in some ways that are the perfect complement to those commissioners in their economic and policy expertise. There's a little bit of politics, at least in an advisory form, to give us some guidance, to give those commissioners some guidance as to where the priorities should be, as to how we should be engaging with a broad audience across Canada. At the same time, I think that it did have a bit of that symbology. It was designed to show that pollution pricing and that carbon pricing need not be tribal, need not be defined by partisan boundaries, but that it was actually possible to agree on this thing despite some fairly fundamental differences in views on other policies. And the fact that all of them were there at the table was important in and of itself, in addition to the advice that they've given the commissioners and the staff over the years. I think that still holds true to both on both sides. I think that I've had very interesting calls with that advisory board, let's put it that way, and they bring something to those conversations that's pretty unique and pretty important, but grounds our work in the real politics across Canada, whether those politics are easy or hard.
That's great. Thanks, Dale. Lisa, we had invited you to participate in this panel to give that regulatory perspective. And if I think about Nik's presentation focusing in on politics and elections, and Dale's on the policy front, yours on the regulatory front, when it comes to polarization and the issues that we're talking about this afternoon, I often think about of elections as kind of the canary in the coal mine, right? Like that's the first place where we might see some of this really playing out. To my mind, the regulatory system, regulatory agencies, and the judicial role in regulation, that's the last bulwark in terms of to what extent, from a democratic perspective, are we an evidence-based, evidence-based decision makers? Because regulatory agencies, the regulatory process is evidence-based decision making par excellence. That's what it does. So thank you for your remarks, and I'm not heartened to hear how concerned you are, frankly, but at the same time, I'm not entirely surprised. You suggested that we should kind of go back to that post-war time when we viewed democracy in a particular way, duty, honor. What I'd like to ask you is the hard question of, is that possible? Given all the social and value change that we've had over the course of the last 6-7 decades, what's your view on that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it follows up on Nik's comments around stability.
Right.
We've been a little micro experiment in Ontario over the last 2 or 3 years about what happens when we go to extremes of either side. When we implement a system of a cap and trade system that is working, but it gets polarized and politicized, and from both sides. On one extreme side, there is a drive and push to get that last carbon molecule out of the electricity system, which is already the best among the very best in the world. 32 kilograms a megawatt hour. literally, it's time to raise your hand and declare success on decarbonization of Ontario's electricity system and to get that electricity into sectors with growing emissions. We didn't do that, and the politics went the opposite side. So we went full pendulum swing, carbon pricing, complete paucity of carbon pricing, $3 billion in assets, $3 billion in potentially stranded assets. That's not stable. And we're facing an energy sector that inherently is conducive to massive change right now. Distributed energy resources, renewables, wireless digitization technology, lots going on where the process itself can be conducive to stability. If we know every time you come before that regulator, this is what the process will be. They will go out and they will seek actual public input. They will have mechanisms to ensure that the public not only has a right to be heard, but feels that it actually has been heard. Justice has to be not only done, but seen to be done in that context. And so I think there is room for positive development, particularly around processes, particularly around how we make decisions that can, in fact, rally the troops around those democratic notions of duty, honor, with the resulting effect being some semblance of stability that eases the collective uncertainty that the world is facing in a rapidly changing sector.
Okay, great. Thanks, Lisa. I want to make sure we've got lots of time for questions because I look out in this audience and I see that we've got a tremendous group of many folks with a lot of experience. So I'm going to throw it to the audience, and I'll give an opportunity for the panelists, probably closer to the end, to say a few last words. I know that that's coming. If you could identify yourself, please.
Thank you very much, Monica. Jacob Irving with the Energy Council of Canada. Question related to the regulatory system in Canada. What's striking to me is whether or not Canadians know what they want out of their regulatory system. What I mean by that is that in the past, opponents to projects have looked at the regulatory system and have levied complaints telling regulators, you've never met a project you didn't like. They'll look at how few projects have ever been denied by any regulators across Canada. And it's a powerful argument, and it sort of makes, and it underlines this idea that the regulators are in on it with the proponents, and that the system's stacked. But to me, what it's always suggested is it's sort of like, how do you evaluate a teacher in a classroom? Do you evaluate whether or not they're a good teacher by how many students they've failed over time? Is that the right way to evaluate them? Or maybe nobody fails in the class because the teacher is good at bringing everybody along, and the end result is to have everybody pass through the class. And I think that us Canadians, we don't know what we want out of the, to me, the regulatory system is something that a proponent must go through, and that really should actually be guiding the proponent to keep doing better to get toward a final yes where all the boxes are ticked and all the right things are done. But it seems that there's a whole other view out there that, well, no, that's actually would mean the regulator being in bed with the proponent. And that what we must do is we must fail some of these projects in order to be able to trust. And I don't think there's any resolution to that, and I'm not sure how to get there, but it seems to be that there's a lot of confusion. Thoughts on that dynamic?
Great. Thoughts from the panel?
I'll start in general. I think what we're seeing, particularly of the regulated public who participates actively, is a real dichotomy in value-based assessment of the pace of change. So those who have very strong values around we must address climate change immediately in this moment, now, will have a very strong leave it in the ground, deny all projects value-based system coming into play. And those who say we need to go through a transition, a slower transition, there's a job element, there's a collective element, we should approve projects to facilitate that smooth transition and to use our energy resources. The regulator is called upon to make a just and reasonable decision in the face of economic evidence largely, but also of value-based evidence and positions of entities. their job is getting increasingly more difficult because they're dealing with distributive justice on any number of aspects, particularly the Indigenous front, particularly the climate front. These are brand new issues that regulators have not had to grapple with to the extent they're dealing with now. But the point is, they have to make well-informed, evidence-based decision, and the evidence they need is beyond what we've traditionally seen. It's not just economic numbers at this point. We have to get in evidence that shows that people actually have been consulted, and that tells people who need to live with those decisions that, yes, we heard your views, and this is why and how we considered them and what the ultimate decision is based on those. And we're missing that now. And in fairness to regulators, tough job, brand new. It's not the work of traditional engineers and economists that we used to see 10 years ago.
Nick?
Yeah, you have to, so I'm not an expert on regulation, I'll start off by saying that. You have to think of the regulator as actually the intersection of good public policy and evidence and the public, because that's where the public slams up against, the project. And, I think one of the things that we've been sadly deficient, and I don't think Canada is any exception, but we've been sadly deficient at reminding people that, and reminding citizens that the role of the regulator is basically to manage risk and to ensure that the public good is part of that. That if there are potential risks related to the project, the regulator, and this is just, I would just say just a fairly high level, the role of the regulator is to make sure that evidence is brought to bear so that all the different aspects of a project can be considered, and if approved, that on the balance of probability that it is in the public good. But I think when people hear regulator, they think of no action, not transparent, faceless, impersonal, not necessarily bought into stakeholders, and they forget what the role of the regulator is. Actually, when we think of regulation and regulators in every sector that make up kind of the country, that's their role, is to kind of protect the public good. So, maybe we don't necessarily need to educate people on the specifics of projects, but we need to educate them to say, yeah, actually, this regulator is not just a little tick box, to kind of Jacob's point, just another little tick box, that it's already in the bag. But that they're actually there to bring evidence to the scene, to the table, to kind of review things, to make sure that the public good is respected, to bring evidence to the table in order to manage the risks. Because, when we talked about, people wanting stability, they're risk averse. When they think about these projects, they don't think about everything that could go right. They think about everything that could go wrong. So maybe we need to kind of reframe that particular perspective.
Next question?
Now, Jeff Simpson. Lisa, I have a question for you as a lawyer. It's going to be a provocative one, so I'll give you a minute to just reflect.
Provocative question from you, Jeff? Never.
I just want to remind us that although we are discussing our present difficulties around energy, etc., the 3 Canadian post-war governments were defeated largely on energy questions. In 1956, the Liberal government lost over the Trans-Canada Pipeline in the House of Commons and was defeated in 1957. 1979, Joe Clark was defeated on a budget that, among other things, had an 18-cent excise tax on gasoline, which the Liberals excoriated in the campaign and won the election. Subsequently, the Liberals introduced the National Energy Policy, which led to their defeat and massacre in Western Canada for a generation. So, in a sense, the politics of energy in Canada have been roiling us for a long time. But there are 3 new things, and you just touched on 2 of them, since the National Energy Policy. One is the court rulings, or at least the rise of Aboriginal interest in these matters, to say the least. The second is climate change. Neither of those issues figured in any of those 3 election defeats. But the last thing that's happened is the role of lawyers in the courts in this matter. We've just been talking, and you've just been talking, about many cases that get appealed. And the Trans Mountain decision was fascinating, for having read it, being an insomniac from start to finish. Because in many, many respects, that decision congratulated governments for the consultation process, for the funding that they'd given interveners. They dismissed all the arguments from Burnaby, all the arguments from Vancouver. And they said, by and large, this process was very fair. But it said there were two areas. Now, that court did not consider any other issues than these narrow legal ones. Didn't consider the economy, didn't consider jobs, didn't consider the 33 groups that didn't appear before them that had signed agreements with the proponents. 6 did not, and they appealed. 33 did, they weren't heard from. So I'm asking you whether we have excessively legalized issues which fundamentally aren't legal questions. They're distributive questions of resources and power, and that the courts have been systematically unwilling to accept their own limitations in this regard. And lawyers are a contributing factor because, like all professionals, they want issues framed in terms of that they themselves can more easily understand as opposed to these other issues. That's the provocation.
I like the question. I like the question a lot because it gets into the meat of where we're going forward. Certainly, the whole concept of deference, and do we trust that first expert economic regulator, is palpable right now, and we're waiting on December 3rd for 3 decisions to come out of the Supreme Court to alter, very likely alter, the legality of the approach to judicial review in the country. And I expect that to have profound implications for what we're talking about. How likely is it that a reviewing appellate decision maker goes in and tinkers with the decision of an expert tribunal? So watch that space, December 3rd. There's a triumvirate of Supreme Court decisions coming out. But secondly, in terms of our role, before we start any proceeding, and there's one that's live right now that definitely, before we start any proceeding, I find it very helpful to remind myself that my duty, my obligation, is to be an officer of the court. First and foremost, to be an officer of the court, and to never put forward a position which is not supported in fact or in law. Particularly if you're playing the game for the long term, you must continually remind yourself that your job is to ensure that facts come to the forefront, that evidence is presented, of course, in a way that's favorable to your client, but in a way that is accurate and full and thorough. And I think by and large, the legal community in the energy bar has been pretty fair. It's one of the more collegial bars. It's one of the bars that actually comes to bear with compromise solutions, and we've seen this in a number of ways. But are there issues around judicial activism? Are there issues around grappling with how we go about distributive justice issues in the absence of policy? Absolutely. But when called upon to make a decision, the courts are forced to decide. They definitely have to and are obliged constitutionally to decide issues of law before them. And many of these are, in fact, issues of law in the absence of clear legal guidance to the contrary. And I think what we're seeing here, and your question really goes to the point of how much legal guidance do we need, and are we finding ourselves in a legal gap that needs to be addressed to facilitate decision-making by the appropriate entity, that being the government instead of some higher trier of fact or regulator who has to make it up on the fly.
Dale or Nick, did you want in on that question?
I'm no lawyer, so I'm staying away from this one.
Well, Jeffrey, I would just note that you would be pleased, I hope, to know that one of the areas that we plan to focus in on for the next 3 years of positive energy looks at roles and responsibilities, including roles and responsibilities between policymakers, regulators, and the courts for exactly some of the reasons that you've noted.
If I can just plant a seed.
Please.
Wither the role of the amicus brief. we have seen very little use of a friend of the court role by truly impartial, nonpartisan, nudge, nudge, wink, wink, Monica, entities. And I think that there's significant opportunity for that amicus, that friend of the court intervention, particularly in our country, where that entity does not have a political axe to grind.
Thanks. Lisa, next question.
Yeah, Patrick McCurdy, University of Ottawa. My question is where the three of you see the civic space that Canadians could go to get information about energy, about fossil fuels, energy transition. And I ask this because something which is missing from your talk, Nick, or I would add, is also the communicative element. Yourself, myself, who are designing communication campaigns, thinking about communication campaigns for various stakeholders. There's a clear shift from fact to emotion in the campaigning of NGOs and the campaigning of corporations. And so the other tension I see here is this debate versus campaign. And we want this civic discourse. However, very much the struggle over energy and the environment is a struggle of statistics, which are manufactured based on perspective. So I think we need to really reflect on the role of campaigning, the shift in the type of ads that NGOs are making, the shift in the type of ads that energy companies are making. I could cite examples, but I'll leave those for now. But the question is, looking at this communicative environment that we're in, the shift in discourse for these energy campaigns, where is the space for Canadians to get accurate, impartial information on this, on these issues? Where do you see it?
Good question. Yeah, Nick.
How about right here at the University of Ottawa? You know, no, when you kind of do polling on all the different players, politicians, regulators, civil servants, NGOs, all that kind of stuff, actually at the top of the list in terms of credibility are universities. Universities still have credibility in our society. Academics still have credibility in our society. And that's why initiatives like Positive Energy and initiatives that are firmly grounded in scholarship and academia that are perceived of as being, I'll just say, more independent than everybody else, maybe not perfect, but more independent than all of the others, with less of a profit motive in the outcomes. So, you know, I would say that's the sweet spot, because you're probably more likely to get people's attention if you have academia intervening. Now, how can we make that academics interesting? Different story, different panel. But, you know, if you can have, you know, I think scholarship, academia, research is probably one way that you could try to cut through the clutter, where you're more likely to get people at least to pay attention. They might not believe it, but the problem is that when you get outside to many of the other players, and that includes the governments, and that includes proponents, and that includes NGOs, there's just, whether fair or not, there is a suspicion that they're not necessarily all operating in the public good. But when it comes to academics, people don't make that same type of direct kind of connection.
Dale, this question seems like it was made for you, so please.
Yeah, I do want to jump in on this one. So I think Ecofiscal has tried very hard to be that voice in some ways, to be a trusted, credible policy voice. And we, as a result, value our independence above almost all else, and that we want to make sure that the decisions that we are making and the recommendations we're making in a report are purely a function of the consensus from those 13 commissioners. And they purely do come from the facts and the evidence. And yes, we may take advice from our advisors, but the decision makers for the commission are the economists. And as a result, we hope that we can drive forward with advice and analysis and recommendations and data that really is objective and impartial and nonpartisan. That being said, I think there is an interesting tension in communicating those findings, exactly as Nick has noted, that we have tried really hard not to be another boring source of data, but to try to engage with a broad audience and try to communicate those findings as broadly as possible while still maintaining their credibility and sticking to the spirit and the evidence that the analysis has unpacked. that's a challenge as well. I think that it's hard sometimes to get outside your echo chamber when you are sticking to the facts and the evidence, and that it's easier to get clicks and retweets, etc., when you're being more provocative and more emotional and more symbolic and trying to appeal to a certain constituency. So I think that is an interesting challenge for sure. The last thing I guess I'll say is I think that the media still has a role to play here too, and that I think we're seeing the media get better and better at challenging statements that may not be entirely rooted in evidence, and to push back on some of those things. And I think that's a trend that I hope we'll see more of.
Lisa, did you want to?
Just 2 seconds. I'd just like to distinguish data and data analytics from narrative. We are definitely experiencing a paucity of a good repository of data in the country. When I need data, I go to the US Energy Information Agency or the International Energy Agency, and then I try and Canadianize what I find there. And the narrative around that, we need a big, at a minimum, repository of everything that we've got that's come forward in terms of hardcore data before any number of regulatory agencies across the country. And we need it for our traditional ecological knowledge of our Indigenous peoples. We need to start a process of recording and really having a great and rich repository of our Indigenous knowledge in the country. In relation to the last point that was made about being nonpartisan about that, and the media, this is where I get to throw one back at you, Jeff. I don't think the media's done a good job. Yep, he's ducking. Particularly on carbon pricing. For 10 years, the media reported on carbon tax or cap and trade. Cap and trade or carbon tax. There's so much more information out there. There's so much more of a nuanced story that we need to get into. And I know it's particularly, it's a little dry to read sometimes, but we need to go beyond a bifurcated, heuristic, yes, no, good, bad debate on some of our most contentious issues.
Great. We have just enough time for a couple more questions. We have 2 more up there, so please go ahead.
Yeah, my name is Stuart Muir. I'm from ResourceWorks from out west. And listening to the categories that are being constructed and are part of this over many years, one thing that recently I've been thinking about, and I'd like to throw it your way, is whether we, in talking about energy as a large category, are conflating in a way that isn't necessarily all that productive a great big thing, energy, when if you, say, split it into just 2 categories, one being energy exports and the other being consumption of energy domestically, whether a lot of the sparks that fly are because we're not seeing eye to eye within those categories or between those 2 categories. So, for example, people who might be very supportive of domestic policy changes are not wanting to play in that space productively because they are not seeing any gains for energy exports.
Thoughts from the panel on that?
Yeah, maybe I'll try with some trepidation. I think you can make different arguments about where to draw the boundaries of conversation, and in some ways, smaller boundaries may be easier and better able to define a specific problem in a specific kind of conversation. But on the other hand, maybe a really broad circle allows for more compromises and more pie for different stakeholders to each have a piece. And I'm not sure where the balance lies between those 2 things. I'm not sure that there is a quick or glib answer for a right or a wrong way to do it, but I think both tensions matter.
Yeah, if I could just add an observation, I would hazard to say that 40, 50 years ago, the energy dialogue was related to jobs and the economy. It did not include the environment, and that was not a good thing. And now we've swung, right, where we talk about energy, and that's all we think about is in the environment. I would hazard to say that a broader discussion that is more holistic as opposed to thinking of trade-offs would probably be fair and probably more realistic. That the paradigm of the past of talking about energy just in terms of dollars and cents and cost and competitiveness is incomplete, because it does not include the environment. And the dialogue that just focuses on energy issues as straight environmental issues is also from, I would say, from a research perspective and for most Canadians, incomplete. Because you know what? Canadians are environmentalists and consumers. They want clean energy, they want the environment to be protected, but at the same time, they want stable prices for their electricity at home. And they're cross-pressured. We should have a discussion that puts a spotlight on those cross pressures, their environmental aspirations and their aspirations as consumers.
Thanks. Last question to you.
Yep. So I'm Helen. I'm with Student Energy. So fairly timely. Looking forward from this conversation. I think the big question mark now is, what will this conversation look like once my generation is sitting on that stage or the generation below me is sitting on that stage? So we've got a great kind of multi-sector panel going on. I would love to hear from each of you, from your sector's perspective, on what you're doing, what your sector is doing right now to enable young people, 18 to 30-year-olds, to have a say in the decisions that are being made for their future with respect to energy, and what you're also doing to invest in their capacity to sustain things like strong carbon policy, improve things like strong carbon policy, improve regulatory processes with the upcoming generation. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Helen. Maybe we'll start at the end and work this way, if that's all right, Lisa?
It's a great question, and the point is illustrated. I gave a talk at Campwood last year about the challenges that the regulator faces in going green and facilitating green decision-making, and I asked the question, okay, in a room of about 1,000 people, raise your hands if you're a millennial. 2. 2 people in the room were millennials, and so we're captured. The regulators are captured. Those of us who act before the regulators are captured. So that was a rally cry for myself to stop drinking my own Kool-Aid on a regular basis, and I did 2 things. I got much more engaged in young professionals in energy, which is those under 40, and young women in energy, and that's the other place where we're captured. I think we're still maybe 10% of the energy economy. So it's a really good point, and it's one that we all do drink our own Kool-Aid to a certain extent, and it's a point of humility. We need to be reminded of it regularly, and I thank you for doing that.
Dale.
Yeah, I'll echo some of Lisa's comments there. It's actually a conversation we had at a recent commissioner meeting. We asked ourselves how we could do better to be engaging with a younger audience, and I think it takes place at a few levels, and I don't think that it's easy to do at all. I think that, for one, my commissioners are mostly professors at universities, so have a direct connection to some of that audience in their classes, and they've made an effort to try to bring what we talk about at Ecofiscal meetings to their classes and to their students in a more direct way. That was one of the outcomes. I think that we have, more broadly as an organization, spent a lot of time recently trying to think about the ways we communicate to different audiences and where it is that audience, that those millennials and the next generation are getting their information. And we've been intentionally dabbling with other ways to disseminate our information, whether it is on other social media like Instagram and things like that my commissioners are absolutely uncomfortable with, but nevertheless trying hard to embrace for exactly the reasons you bring up.
Nick?
If I could just add, I'm really sounding kind of like a downer today, but when it comes to things like climate change, people feel powerless. It's like telling them that the ocean is boiling and what you should do about it. And, I would say if there's one thing that needs to change and one thing that millennials have to do that I think this generation is not, is to remember that small sacrifices and small actions actually add up to make a difference. Being a mathematician, I'm a big believer in compound interest. So it's kind of like all that little interest adds up after 10 years, 20 years, 50 years, and then you've got something fantastic after that. I think if we could, I think part of the frustration when it comes to energy and environmental issues is there's also a sense of powerlessness, and we need a narrative on what everybody can do to contribute to achieve the objectives that we want to achieve, and so that they can participate in that solution and feel that maybe we haven't solved everything, but everyone can participate in doing one thing. And it could be it's like a community making what it would conceive of as a sacrifice, or a young person doing something positive in terms of advancing kind of, I'll say, the reconciliation between the economy and the environment. And I think that's the change that has to happen. Because as long as people think, oh, the regulators will fix this, we'll wait for another politician to give us an answer, it'll be somebody else's problem, someone else will pay that carbon tax, it will never work, right, until we actually get people engaged.
So 1 minute to each of you maximum, because we're at time, but I wanted to ask each of you to just, and maybe 30 seconds on one topic and 30 seconds on the other. So 30 seconds, when it comes to this issue of polarization, what keeps you up at night? But then when it comes to this issue of polarization, what gets you up in the morning? What are some of the things that you look to in terms of optimism? So 30 seconds on both of those topics. And Lisa, you're nodding your head, so you must have something that you've got in mind.
Yeah, choosing is the problem. What keeps me up at night? The inaction that ensues from where we're at on the polarization front. And I've been playing in the carbon policy realm for 20 years, and you put up a great graph today to show all the commitments we've made. Mike and Monica put up this great graph about every single Canadian commitment, and it was a path line of my career. Literally, the first year I started working, we've not hit one, and we're not going to hit the current one. That keeps me up at night because we have to. If a country like ours, a country that by and large has a great democratic tradition and has a wealth of resources and has a great diverse population, can't get it done, who can? So that keeps me up at night. And what gets me up in the morning? A lot of great people, a lot of good energy. And I'm very, very optimistic that if we just start communicating to each other, to people who we don't normally communicate with, and listening better, figuring out how the messages resonate and how somebody else considers things, we'll get there. Otherwise, I'd be crazy. 25 years climate policy, I'd be crazy. Yeah.
Thanks, Lisa.
You
Dale?
might still be crazy, Lisa, but I will echo some of that too. I think there's a very good chart in Jeffrey Simpson's book that he authored with Mark Jackert showing exactly that failure to advance, and that certainly worries me as well. And it worries me that even when we are doing the best we can to advance this issue and making real progress to push the rock up the hill, it still ends up rolling back down on us. That paralysis that we've seemed to face as a society in advancing good policy is certainly something that keeps me up at night. In terms of the optimism, I'm going to cheat and give you a couple here. And I think one is the very good conversations I have with individuals about this kind of content all the time, and that it's easy to get lost in these big macro narratives about society as a whole, and sometimes those individual conversations can bring a whole new perspective and a whole new light and a whole lot of optimism sometimes. And that ties as well to the question that was asked before about younger generations and the next wave. And I think a lot of those conversations are the ones that are most positive, and there is most appetite for doing things differently, and recognizing that, yes, shocks to the system aren't appealing to anybody, but we also can't stick to a status quo that we're on right now. Business as usual isn't a viable option.
Great. Nick?
What keeps me up at night? Two things. First of all, that there is no fundamental agreement on the diagnosis of the problem. In the past, when there were competing parties, and there was an issue like crime, right, poverty, all those things, there would be a general agreement on what was happening, and then there'd be disagreement on the solution. We don't even have an agreement on the diagnosis of the problem, and that's a fundamental problem. The other thing that keeps me at night is that politicians and the media, with respect, feed on conflict and confrontation. Can I tell you, good public policy, bad for ratings, bad for politicians. It does not capture people's attention. So those are the things that kind of keep me up at night. A problem in regards to kind of a common sense of what the diagnosis is, and then an environment which amps up and feeds and lives on confrontation and controversy. On the positive side of the ledger, if I could kind of take a variation, I know Lisa talked about duty honor, maybe it would be the fact that Canada, compared to most other places, is built on a principle of respect, that our country exists because it is pragmatic and we believe in compromise. Maybe as opposed to, duty honor, that's way up there. Maybe we should just remind Canadians that what makes us great as an experiment, as a nation, at least to date, is the fact that we've been able to respectfully work out solutions. That we started off as a compromise, and look how wonderful that compromise has worked. And that maybe we should apply those very Canadian principles to this particular problem.
Great. Thank you. That leaves us on a little bit more of a positive note. So I'd like to invite everyone to thank the panel with me. What a terrific set of discussions. Now, for those of you who are here in the room, we have a reception and a little bit of goodies waiting for you. Prior to doing that, though, I wanted to make sure to give an additional thank you to the financial supporters of Positive Energy. I won't list them all again. I did that at the outset, but collectively, they represent Canadian energy from a policy, regulatory, and industry perspective across the sector. The other two people, very special people I wanted to thank, one is Dr. Marissa Beck, who helped organize this panel. She's the research director for Positive Energy and at the ISSP. And then the second individual, a very special thank you to Raphael Desordi, who's our communications and outreach specialist, without whom none of this would be possible. So please join me in thanking.